Dean Martin's hands were empty. That's the first thing the audience noticed when he walked onto the stage of his television show in March 1967. Empty hands, no drink, no glass, nothing. In 7 years of the Dean Martin Show, Dean had never walked on stage without a drink. It was his trademark, his signature, the thing everyone expected, the cool guy with the cocktail. But tonight, his hands were empty. The audience started murmuring. Something was wrong. People turned to each other. Where's his drink? Is he sick? What's happening? Dean stood center stage and let the confusion build. He looked at the audience. He looked at the camera. Then he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, "NBC has asked me to stop drinking on television." The murmuring stopped. The studio went silent. 18 million people watching at home stopped what they were doing and stared at their television screens. Was Dean Martin being censored? Was he about to quit? Was this the end of the Dean Martin Show? Dean let the silence hang for 3 full seconds. Then, without saying another word, he turned and walked to the side of the stage. There was a bar cart there, chrome, gleaming under the studio lights, bottles lined up, glasses waiting. Dean picked up a bottle. The sound of liquid pouring filled the silent studio, ice cubes clinking into glass. The audience held its breath. Dean walked back to center stage. He held the glass up high, made sure everyone could see it. The camera zoomed in. 18 million people at home saw that glass clearly. Dean looked directly into the camera, straight at NBC's executives watching from their offices, straight at the sponsors who'd complained, straight at everyone who'd told him to stop. And he said 5 words. "So this is my last one." The audience exploded. The studio erupted in laughter and applause. At home, millions of people roared with laughter. Dean Martin had just publicly defied NBC's censorship order with the most perfectly timed joke in television history. And he kept doing it, every episode, for 7 more years, always the same line, "This is my last one." The greatest 7-year troll in television history. To understand why this moment was so significant, you need to understand what had happened the week before. The Dean Martin Show had premiered in 1965 and quickly became one of the highest-rated programs on television. The format was simple. Dean would sing, tell jokes, introduce guest stars, and do comedy sketches. But the real appeal was Dean's persona, the cool guy who always had a drink in his hand and made everything look effortless. It wasn't real, of course. Dean Martin rarely drank alcohol. What looked like whiskey on stage was usually apple juice or iced tea. But the audience didn't know that. They just knew Dean as the smooth, slightly tipsy entertainer who never took anything too seriously. The sponsors loved it at first. The ratings were incredible. NBC was making millions. Everything was perfect. Then the letters started coming. Parents wrote to NBC complaining that Dean Martin was promoting alcohol consumption to children. Religious groups said the drinking persona was inappropriate for family television. Community organizations called for boycotts. The sponsors got nervous. In 1967, advertisers had enormous power over television content. If sponsors pulled out, shows got canceled. It was that simple. Procter & Gamble, one of the show's biggest sponsors, sent a letter to NBC. The message was clear. Tone down the drinking, or we'll reconsider our advertising relationship. NBC panicked. The Dean Martin Show was making them millions, but losing Procter & Gamble would be catastrophic. They called a meeting with Dean. The meeting happened in NBC's executive offices in Burbank. 5 network executives sat on one side of a conference table. Dean Martin sat on the other, alone. The senior executive, a man named Robert Howard, led the conversation. "Dean, we have a problem. The sponsors are concerned about your drinking persona. Parents are writing letters. We're getting pressure to make changes.
Dean sipped his coffee. What kind of changes? We need you to stop holding drinks on camera. No more jokes about drinking. No more acting tipsy. Just sing, tell jokes, introduce guests. Be charming without the alcohol references. Dean was quiet for a moment. You want me to change my entire persona? We're not asking you to change who you are, another executive said. Just what you do on camera. The drinking bit has run its course. It's time to evolve. Dean looked at the 5 executives staring at him. He knew what this was really about. Money, sponsors, corporate pressure. This had nothing to do with what was good for the show or what the audience wanted. This was about keeping advertisers happy. What if I say no? Dean asked. The executives shifted uncomfortably. Robert Howard spoke carefully. Dean, you have a contract with NBC. If we tell you the show needs to change, you need to cooperate. Otherwise, we have options. The threat was clear. Do what we say, or we'll cancel your show. Dean finished his coffee. He stood up. Okay, he said. I'll stop. The executives were surprised. They'd expected pushback, an argument, maybe threats from Dean's lawyers. But Dean had just agreed without a fight. Really? Robert Howard asked. Sure, Dean said. If that's what you want, I'll stop drinking on television. Dean walked out of the meeting. The executives sat there, stunned. That was easier than they'd expected. Problem solved. The sponsors would be happy. Everything would be fine. They had no idea what Dean Martin was planning. That week, Dean went to his writers. I need something special for the opening of next week's show, he said. He explained what NBC had demanded. The writers listened and they started brainstorming. What they came up with was brilliant, a perfectly timed act of defiance disguised as compliance. The following week, when the Dean Martin show taped, something was different from the moment Dean walked on stage. The empty hands, the confused audience, the tension building. Dean's announcement that NBC had asked him to stop drinking was technically true. He was simply informing the audience of what the network had demanded. Nothing wrong with transparency, right? Then the walk to the bar cart, the deliberate pouring of the drink, the ice cubes clinking, the camera zoom, all of it was choreographed to build anticipation. And then the line, "So this is my last one." It was perfect. It technically complied with what NBC had asked for. This would be his last one. But everyone in the audience understood the joke. Everyone knew Dean was saying he'd stop after this one, and the next one, and the one after that. The audience erupted because they recognized what Dean had done. He'd taken a corporate censorship demand and turned it into comedy gold. He'd defied NBC while pretending to comply. It was malicious compliance at its finest. In NBC's executive offices, Robert Howard and the other executives watched the broadcast with growing horror. Dean Martin had just publicly announced that they'd tried to censor him, and then he'd done exactly what they'd told him not to do, on live television in front of 18 million people. Howard picked up the phone to call Dean's people. He was going to demand that Dean stop immediately, but before he could dial, another executive stopped him.
Look at the phones, the executive said. NBC's phone lines were lighting up, calls coming in from all over the country, thousands of them. They weren't complaints, they were congratulations. People calling to say they loved what Dean had done, that he was standing up for creative freedom, that NBC should leave him alone. The next day, the ratings came in. The episode had been the highest-rated Dean Martin show ever broadcast. More people had watched Dean defy NBC than had ever watched the show before. And the sponsor response? Procter & Gamble's sales of products advertised during the Dean Martin show went up 15% that week. Turns out, controversy sells. NBC was trapped. They couldn't force Dean to stop now. The ratings were too good, the sponsors loved the increased sales, the audience had spoken clearly. Dean Martin could do whatever he wanted.
So Dean kept doing it, every single episode. Every time he took a drink on stage, he'd say with perfect timing, "This is my last one." Sometimes he'd say it with a wink, sometimes with a serious expression. Sometimes he'd look directly at the camera when he said it. The audience never got tired of it. It became a running joke that lasted 7 years. People tuned in just to hear Dean deliver that line. It became part of the show's identity. The beautiful irony was that Dean still wasn't really drinking. It was still apple juice or iced tea in those glasses. But now, instead of just being part of his persona, the fake drinking had become an act of rebellion, a middle finger to corporate censorship, a reminder that artists don't have to do what executives tell them if they're smart enough to fight back with comedy. NBC never tried to censor Dean Martin again. They'd learned their lesson. You can't control someone who's willing to turn your demands into comedy. The writers of The Dean Martin Show loved the last one bit so much that they started writing sketches around it. Guest stars would reference it. Dean would find new ways to deliver the line. It evolved from a single act of defiance into one of the most iconic running jokes in television history. In 1973, when Dean Martin decided to end The Dean Martin Show after 9 seasons, he did something special for the final episode. After his last performance, after thanking the audience and the crew, Dean poured himself one final drink. He held it up to the camera. The audience grew quiet, knowing this was actually the end. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean said with a smile, "this really is my last one." The audience gave him a standing ovation that lasted 4 minutes. Today, the clip of Dean Martin saying, "So this is my last one," is one of the most shared television moments from the 1960s. It shows up in compilations about comedic timing, in videos about standing up to authority, in retrospectives about television history.
But more than that, it's become a template for how to handle censorship with humor. When corporations try to control artists, when sponsors demand changes, when executives think they know better than the talent, Dean Martin's 5 words are the perfect response. "So this is my last one." It's a promise to comply, and a promise to never really comply. It's obedience and rebellion in the same breath. It's the perfect joke because it works on multiple levels, and it kept working for 7 years. The lesson of Dean Martin's 5 words isn't just about television or comedy. It's about creative freedom. It's about not letting corporations dictate your art. It's about finding clever ways to say no when powerful people demand that you change. Dean Martin understood something fundamental. If you're talented enough, funny enough, and brave enough, you can defy authority and get away with it. Not through confrontation, not through lawsuits or public fights, but through perfect comedic timing. NBC told Dean Martin to stop drinking on television, so he announced that he was stopping, and then he kept going for 7 more years. Every episode, every drink, always with the same perfectly delivered line. "So this is my last one." It became more than just a joke. It became a statement. A reminder that artists don't have to surrender their vision just because executives get nervous. That sometimes the best response to censorship isn't anger or compliance, it's comedy. Dean Martin won that fight with 5 words, and he kept winning it over and over for 7 years. That's not just comedic timing, that's genius. If this story of perfect rebellion and creative freedom moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with anyone who's ever been told to change their art by people who don't understand it. Leave a comment about a time you stood up for what you believed in with humor instead of anger. And ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about artists who refuse to compromise their vision.